Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we move along here to talk about the upcoming season for the Raiders. And the Raiders are coming into this year, given the fact that they just promoted interim head coach Antonio Pierce last year, and things were really messy for the majority of the season under Josh McDaniels, but it was clear there was an immediate change of emotion in the room when they did bring in Antonio Pierce as the interim. And I think that, again, when you talk about what it takes sort of in the NFL just to be able to emerge onto the scene and outperform expectations, it starts with just having a common belief that it's possible. And Antonio Pierce was able to do so last year. Now, the issue for the Raiders is that they still weren't able to actually address the offense all that much, and specifically that quarterback position, where it seemed like they were hoping to be able to take one of the top quarterbacks in this past year's draft, but with 6 quarterbacks going in the top 12 picks and them sitting at number 13, that just was not possible. So they end up taking Brock Bowers instead, which can be a really impactful positional player, and I want to sort of dive into their weapons in a moment here, but it leaves them with Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew as the 2 candidates for winning the starting quarterback job. Now, I would have to imagine that Gardner Minshew probably gives you a greater chance to win this season, but it sounds like the early thoughts are that Aiden O'Connell is currently winning the job in Vegas. They took him in the 4th round last year, so maybe you hope that you can find a little bit of a diamond in the rough there. Ultimately, though, I don't think that either one of them are going to give you, even call it top 20 quarterback play in the league, and I don't want to bury the Raiders just for that alone. It goes a lot more in. There's a lot more that goes into it than just the quarterback position. But frankly, I'm not a believer in that. Now, I think that Antonio Pierce can sort of will them to some wins, and I don't think that their roster is necessarily, miles behind some of the other playoff contention teams, but they're going through a number of different changes this offseason. Notably, they lost Josh Jacobs in the offseason. Now, Zamir White seems like a prime candidate to have a breakout season and take over the starting role there and do so while flourishing. I understand the Raiders not necessarily wanting to pay money at that position, but I do think that it's a downgrade. Now, that's more of a statement, in my opinion, on Josh Jacobs, who I am definitely a fan of. But, Zamir White, Alexander Madison, Amir Abdullah, that's what you're looking at from a running back core. I don't think it's all that deep, and I think that it's definitely a downgrade from Josh Jacobs. Now, you look at their stats from last season, very pedestrian overall, where, like I just mentioned, you already weren't a good run team last year, 30th in the NFL, but for whatever it's worth as well, I do think that is at least somewhat predicated on the fact that the pass game just wasn't really all that much of a threat. And you do look at now the situation, you would at least have, if it is O'Connell, that he is more experienced. He really struggled with turnovers in his rookie season. As long as he can just sort of limit the damage there, that maybe this turns into an offense that can have some threats. If you get yourself a Zamir White breakout season, you already have Devontae Adams, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, available to you. Jacoby Myers was a pretty nice signing for them last offseason, was dealing with some concussion injuries, but when he was available, he was really good. Trey Tucker flashed some potential as well, and like I mentioned, you draft Brock Bowers after already last year taking Michael Mayer out of Notre Dame in the 2nd round, that they might have one of the best tight end rooms in the NFL. And I think that Bowers and Mayer can give you a lot of positional flexibility as well in terms of being able to I think that Bowers will be able to line up outside some, but both of them, either way, you add just a couple big bodies into the room that I think that the overall weapons are pretty solid. Now, the offensive line has some questions. Colton Miller has become a really promising left tackle that I feel good about that there. And I did really like the draft pickup for them in Jackson Powers Johnson, who played center at Oregon. Now, on ESPN, he's currently listed as the potential starting right guard for them, so we'll see there. But just some unproven there, I would say, on the right side of their offensive line. So could be an average or slightly below average group out of the Raiders on the offensive line from a standpoint. But defensively, they add themselves a big-time hitter in Christian Wilkins, formerly with the Miami Dolphins. And Christian Wilkins, I think that he just does not get enough respect nationally for how much of a dominant player he is. From an interior, defensive lineman position, he's able to give you incredible run support. And this past year especially was able to flourish a little bit in terms of the pass rushing standpoint. A career high 9 sacks. And that's something that, paired up with Max Crosby himself, I think could be a lethal duo up front. But the defense was overall a pretty good performing group last year. You see the biggest concern with them is that run stop, so I am curious how much of a priority, and I'm curious almost if you were to go back and ask the Miami coaches last year if there was more of an emphasis to get Christian Wilkins looks on the pass rush as opposed to being the run stopper. But either way, he's going to be able to do whatever you ask of him, really. Paired with Max Crosby, things start to get scary there. I do think that they have some pretty good depth from the front line, specifically Malcolm Kuntz, an emerging player for them. Adam Butler, solid defensive tackle as well. If they were able to get any sort of breakout season from Tyree Wilson, who they drafted in the top 10 last year, and ultimately had a very disappointing season, that if he could emerge onto the scene for them as well, you're looking at a borderline elite pass rush overall. But it's when you look at the back half of their defense that is where you start to have some question marks. Robert Spillane had a really nice season from the middle linebacker position last year. Diablo was a fine player. But I look at that secondary as well. Jack Jones, somebody that has, whenever he's been available on the football field, he's been a very nice contributor, going back to when he was with the Patriots. And last year, I think he switched over mid-season to the Raiders. But the issue is that personality, or I don't know if personality, off-the-field antics would have gotten in his way a little bit. And the most recent example is bringing a gun to Logan Airport in Boston, which is a psychotic move. But at the same time, the kid can ball. So Jack Jones, if we see a 17-game sample size out of him and he's able to put up similar production, he could definitely put himself into some conversations in terms of young up-and-coming cornerbacks. I do like Trayvon Moehrig from the safety position as well. Just a very solid starter that's able to, hold down the scene a little bit for you. And I think that, there's some other names in there as well. Marcus Epps, Nate Hobbs. I don't want to, make them up to be any sort of a top-tier secondary. It's definitely a group that has promise, but I think that is just the thing, is there's a lot of unproven. I think that in large part it's going to fall on Antonio Pierce to be able to make the most out of the situation. Looking at their schedule for the upcoming year, they are on the more difficult end. It is the 9th hardest schedule according to Sharp Football Analysis. I look especially early on here. I think they have a pretty difficult schedule overall. Now, also playing the NFC South, so you get a couple games in there, such as the Panthers at home, that you can feel good about. But even still, a lot of those South matchups are on the road. at Tampa Bay, in New Orleans, and I think that ultimately, when you look at this set schedule for the Raiders, there just aren't too many, given wins. And I understand the Raiders do consistently outperform expectations, and I'm really rooting for Antonio Pierce, but I think when you look at the quarterbacks they're going to be facing this year and just the way this is all going to shake out, I don't feel great about the Raiders overall. Now, again, they always outperform expectations. I'm sure there are a couple games that you can look in there, maybe some difficult-ish rosters, and you look at the LA Rams, the Jacksonville Jaguars, those types of games that I do look at. You throw the Saints in there as well, or the Buccaneers, of teams that could, you feel like on paper the Raiders should maybe lose to, that they could possibly end up surprising, but I do have the Raiders as a 5-win team this year. Anthony comments, in your honest opinion, do you feel that Antonio Pierce is possibly a lame duck coaching-wise? They're going to fire him if it doesn't work? Well, that's the thing. I think they win 5 games this year, and if you look at specifically that quarterback position, it is just sort of not filled between Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. I feel like if you injected that front office with truth serum, they would prefer to have some sort of another option to lean on. I don't think that either one of them are going to be the starter come 2025, but you do look at the schedule again. I especially worry about Antonio Pierce in that first stretch of the season, where outside of week 3 at home against the Panthers, I think that's a pretty difficult schedule overall, and it's going to take some of those, middling teams on the road against Denver, at home against Pittsburgh, and again, I mentioned, Rams probably a little bit higher up on the totem pole there, but on the road against the Rams, like, those are games that I think Antonio Pierce is going to need to be able to, show that, no, he's not some incredible offensive mastermind or anything, but as a motivator, he is able to coach up a team to be able to come away with those 50-50 games. Anthony says, do you feel that it's unfair to these coaches that might be a bridge coach, that they're stuck with a rebuilding scenario and they can't really do anything they want? I mean, to that, I would say you look at, who was it? Lovie Smith, when he was with the Texans. The Texans, for a while there, were just sort of a revolving door, and I thought that that was completely unfair at the time. And it's a tough situation to be in, because those things can sort of, weigh on your overall reputation if you do have a bad year. But I would like to think that, especially after the Raiders tried to go out and poach a top offensive mind in Josh McDaniels and see just how flat that fell because of the personality standpoint, that I think Antonio Pierce does have a legitimate chance. Now, again, it is probably not the top end in terms of job security, that I don't necessarily feel great for him in that sense, but I do think that he could make it out. Anthony says the Chicago Bears, another good example of they fired their coach that won them the Super Bowl. They have been having a revolving door for the past 2 decades. I mean, I think for the Bears as well, it's the coaching situation. I think John Fox was the one that seemed like that was the one that I thought was going to work out for him after he was fired from Denver. But I think the Bears also have sort of had a talent problem as well. So I'm definitely with you in terms of, yes, the Bears have definitely been a revolving door. Matt Nagy as well, winning the Coach of the Year for them, only to be fired, I think it was 2 years later. But it also comes down to, the roster building there, and I do think that Ryan Poles has put an incredible group there together in Chicago. So for Pierce, again, I think that I'm hoping he has like a 2-year leash here, as long as things aren't absolutely terrible and as long as the locker room is still on board. The Raiders are just sort of looking for an identity, and Antonio Pierce just might be the guy that, while the entire NFL seems to be moving on to, these offensive specialists, that sometimes a hard-nosed coach is able to just be enough for you. Anthony says, can't stand the owner in Miami. He has to be cheap for a coach because he doesn't want to give full control out to anybody. I mean, that's definitely part of it as well, which is why I think in this Antonio Pierce situation, he's not looking for really any amount of power. He's just looking to, make a name for himself and inspire this group. So looking at how I have the Raiders lined up with the other teams that we've previewed so far, again, I think that the Raiders could definitely end up winning a bunch of extra games, and if they do, it's going to be because Antonio Pierce, again, in that locker room and just buying in there. But I think the quarterback, the handicap at the quarterback position is going to be really tough for them to overcome. But definitely let me know in the comments section who you would expect to be the difference maker for the Raiders if they are to rattle off some more wins than expected. They're currently sitting at 6.5 wins per Vegas. But again, let me know on that front. With last night's game, we are just around the corner from NFL football, though, full time here. And I just want to go through and list off some of the storylines I'm looking forward to seeing play out the most and what my expectations are. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.